Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our midweek study as we go through the book of Daniel. And again, this is very exciting. I'm going to break it into a little shorter section for today, just recapping on where we were previous session. King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. He couldn't, was very troubled by the dream. He did not, for reasons unknown, want to share the meaning of the dream, whether he couldn't remember it or he wanted to put his wise men to the test, figuring that if they could interpret or tell him what he dreamt, that he could then believe the interpretation of it. So maybe he had been maybe fooled. Maybe he had a dream before and told them everything, and they gave him an explanation that he wasn't so comfortable with. So, however, this got set up was God's doing. It put Daniel in a place where he could receive the understanding of what the dream was, first of all, that Nebuchadnezzar saw, and then he was able to give the interpretation. So today we're going to break the dream apart. And so as we start in verse 31, kind of showing you, we're reading from a Hebrew commentary, and then we'll go to another one just to kind of expose you to all the different sources that we have available. And then what's interesting here is this dream, we're going to see how it was interpreted through a Jewish current theology or current mindset, comparing that to a Christian perspective, looking at it as we maybe have been taught in many of our churches and Bible studies. So there's a lot going on in this dream. And so, as you can see on your screen, following along, reading from the Jewish uh, Bible, thou king saw and beheld a great image, or behold a great image. This image, which was mighty and whose brightness was surpassing, stood before thee, and the image thereof was terrible. So, again, the commentators really don't say much here. It just says it was a great image. They put an emphasis on one great image. They talk about this image having some kind of um, understanding as to what it's going to be thought of. The great image of a human being is really what they're trying to pull together. And that's what we'll see in a moment. But looking at the words that would give them an understanding of what this image was as a human being. And so the image was terrible. Often wonder the word terrible, what that meant to them. I can think of other words that we use are maybe frightening, startling, hideous. Um, I can picture images based upon, things that we've seen, especially coming into the Halloween season here, and the images that people have on their lawns and things that show up as part of Halloween folklore. But here he uses the word terrible, and maybe we'll take a look at that a little bit later and see if we can discern what terrible meant to them. Continuing verse 32, and as for that image, it had a head of fine gold. Interesting that he was able to tell the difference of the quality of the gold. Was it 14 karat, 18 karat, whatever the grades are? He knew this was fine gold. Its breast and arms of silver, its midsection thighs of brass, its legs were of iron, its feet part of iron and part of clay, which is very interesting. We'll talk a lot about that later on. And then in the midst of this vision, he saw a stone that was cut without hands. So how do we visualize that? Did the stone just come out of this solid rock? What gave the impression that it was cut? Um, was it very rectangular? Did it have a shape to it that obviously wasn't, that showed that it wasn't just broken off? It wasn't rounded by the water. it was cut and must have had dimensions and shape to it that it was very evident that it was not just happenstance. It wasn't just a boulder laying around, that it was cut. But yet, how did they know it was cut without hands? What gave them that impression? If I just saw a stone laying there, I would assume someone cut it out. How did he know that it was cut without hands, or did he see it come out of the solid rock in this shape and cut to a form that he knew that it just didn't break out? So some questions that come to mind. And then this stone, which had to fly through the air, float through the air, and being directed to the feet of this image, and it hit the feet and smashed them, broke them into pieces. And verse 35, then was the iron, the clay, the brass, and the silver, and the gold broken in pieces together. So it would had to have crashed down because the feet were broken. So it couldn't support the rest of it. And as this comes down, it broke. Now, obviously, these are strong metals. You have the silver, the gold, the brass, the iron aren't just going to break from falling down. So there had to be a power, if you will, that came upon it that caused all of these to break in pieces that became like wheat, the chaff of a summer threshing floor, that they came crashing down, disintegrated into tiny little pieces. And these pieces obviously are heavier than uh, the light things of chaff or of oats and grain and things like that, but yet the wind was able to carry them away. And they were so disseminated that there was no place found for them. And the stone that broke the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So that's where we're going to stop at end of verse 35. So again, if you've heard any sermons about this, you may be filling in the blanks as we read this, but we're going to look at it first here to see how the um, Jewish people take this without any influence of Christian thought. So they saw this fine gold. He then translate this as good gold, high thighs or hips, brass. He again in the Bible, brass and bronze are very similar metals. They're just different compositions, and so we have the brass age. Uh, so he's saying this might be better to be called bronze. Then the legs are the thighs. Verse 34 continues that this Jewish sage, Methuselah David, points out that the Hebrew words, or excuse me, the Aramaic words are very clumsy. And so they take notice of that, which again is something that we would not notice unless we were very skilled in the language. And obviously it doesn't translate, as they're translating it, they're going to try to smooth it out into English that makes sense. So I find fascinating when the Jewish sages will notice that the words are clumsy and take that as a meaning that, there's some potentially deeper understanding to be seen when they see sentence structure that seems strange. So that's being pointed out here. And then it was cut out. Verse 45 states that the stone was hewn from a mountain, which, as he points out, is not a feature common in Babylon. Babylon doesn't have mountains around it. So all adds to this mystery of this dream and gives us the opportunity to look at deeper meanings that are there. He does point out that this was made without hands and right away attributes it to God's hands, divine agency, which again will be picked up by the Christian commentators as we get to that second part. So then the stone fell upon its feet. Again, we're going to look at, he's jumping ahead, that these Gentile nations that were represented will follow one another and will ultimately succeed one after another, and they will ultimately be destroyed. The iron is broken into pieces. And so again, he also points out here that the fall wouldn't have done it. This had to have been broken by a divine supernatural force. And so then pointing out again that this image of the mountain grew and filled this entire um, point of earth. And of course, they point out here, which is again something we'll remember when we look at the Christian implication of it, is that ultimately they feel divine rule will be over all mankind. So that's kind of interesting. So what we want to now look at is what would this image have looked like? And so you could search on the internet, which is just a wealth of information. Type in Daniel's image, and you'll get thousands of photos. I picked one that was at least clear and large enough to see on the screen. And of course, it shows the head of gold, and understanding that these will be later on talked about by Daniel and interpreted as different kingdoms that are coming up. The head of gold would be King Nebuchadnezzar of current Babylon. It mentions the time here of 609 BC to 539 BC. The next realm that would be coming, or next kingdom, would be that of the Medians and Persians, 539 BC to 331. And I believe that this change of conquest here does come in play of the book of Daniel. So we'll see that come to pass. And then the realm after that is when the Grecian Empire would take over and conquer from 331 to 168. This would be Alexander the Great that set up the realm of the Greeks. And then finally, the legs of iron is understood to be the Roman Empire, which dissipated the Grecian Empire from 168 BC. And then here's where, when we get into the Christian side of it, this will become very interesting, is that did the Roman Empire ever fade away? We obviously know that there was a Roman Empire that was in power in a physical realm, in a political realm, but then the Roman Empire that took over in a somewhat spiritual realm, church realm, um, actually came into play uh, around 486 AD. And so, and again, this is depending upon your religious background. It depends upon which theology, the church and denomination you belong to teaches this. There's some discrepancies here over what's going on. And so this realm here is not by is by a more evangelical type of institution. And so they look at the Roman Church and state continuing until this current time. And then, of course, realm five is, as Jews pointed out, when God would rule over the earth and he would be in charge of things. Christian viewpoint would say this is Christ's kingdom coming with the second coming. And again, the book of Revelation has many things that are not easy to understand, and they tie into this. And you'll see a lot of correlation between the book of Daniel, some things in the book of Ezekiel, and then in the book of Revelation that have intrigued people ever since it was written. And there are many websites of people who really spend a lot of time digging into what they feel is Bible prophecy and coming up with many different understandings and interpretations. And for the past 40 years that I've been following this, I've seen many of them come purport their reasonings, make predictions, and in most all of those, I've seen the dates come and go. And yet, we don't really know a lot. We can make predictions, but ultimately this is in God's hands, and He will move as He deems appropriate and as His timing comes forth. Obviously, what's happening in the Middle East right now, the unrest there, all of those conflicts, the conflicts in our not only our nation's government, but in governments all around the world, and the unrest and things that are happening, I believe, are all part of this end time prophecy. Um, but we don't know how long it will take to play out. Some of these took hundreds and hundreds of years to play out. Ours is moving in a way now that looks very concerning with what's happening in Israel, but we don't know, if this is something that's going to be resolved and then just escalate later on, or if it's going to lead from this point into something that we would consider fits into Bible prophecy. Only God knows. That we just need to watch and, of course, be ready and be living in a way that whatever God decides to do, we know we're um, fitting in with His calling and His plan in our life. So, from that point, I'd like to take you to another source that may interest you. This is on a website called Chabad.org, and they have the complete Jewish Bible with another commentator called Rashi. Rashi lived in, I believe, you call him a medieval commentator, being the time frame that he lived in, somewhere in 11th, 12th, 13th century, approximately in that time, and was very prolific and wrote a lot and found a lot of followers. So in here you can hide, click on this button, you'll see the verses we just read. You click show and it will give his commentary. So we're going to scroll down to the 31st verse of where we picked up and just see if Rashi has anything to add, because some of his interpretations are quite unique. And so we get on verse 31 here in these kind of brown shaded. Rashi talks about you were watching, talks about the beholding the image, and he said it had a large base. This is interesting. I don't know that we picked that up on the other version that we read. He talks about it being unusual splendor. Here, remember we said that we used the word terrifying. Here, Rashi is translating this and uses the words frightening. Its form was frightening. Again, very interesting. Let's take a look at what that word could have been. Here in Bible Hub. It uses the word dechiel, which is translated as awesome. If we click on this and unpack that word, this is obviously an Aramaic word. It comes from the word to fear. And so it was something that was made a fearful, that caused them to be fearful when they saw it. So again, very simple, but yet gives us some words to think about as we look at this word of terrifying, of awesome, or of frightening. Again, these are all skilled Bible translators and coming up with some very different words, awesome and frightful, awesome and fearful. Again, these are words that we can think about when we read verses that talk about God and his nature, and even just commonly thinking the fear of the Lord. Well, fear can mean different things to many different people. For myself, I like to look at it as a respect. The word awesome or being in awe is also how I feel I want to think of it when I read these verses, because, the Lord tells us not to fear. So why would he tell us not to fear in one place, but then we're supposed to fear him in other places if the meaning was the same? And so I believe this is where we have the opportunity to look at the meanings of these words and apply a little bit of balance, a little bit of understanding that helps us to understand how we are supposed to think of God in a way that maybe is different than what our 21st century vocabulary tells us fear should be. So going back to his translation here in Rashi, the materials were fine gold. Um, doesn't give us a lot here. And what's going to be interesting, though, is the mixture of iron and clay that's at the bottom. Obviously, this is not a natural formation. Iron and clay do not mix in any natural form. So just to have them exist together in this image would have been a supernatural understanding of how they would stick together. And then, of course, as they fell down, they crumbled, they became tiny little pieces that were light enough to be blown away with the wind. It doesn't say how strong the wind was, but they were blown away because the understanding of it is that everything would dissipate, everything would be torn apart, everything would fall by the wayside, and there'd be nothing left to find any pieces of, and replacing that would be God's kingdom and his realm. So that's where we're going to stop today. We will then come back next week, Lord so willing, and pick up with Daniel as he then interprets this dream in verse 36. So take care. Thank you so much for joining this, and may God bless you this week. Bye-bye.